This week's guest for Touch Base in Seoul is a writer whose book, Korea24, has already reviewed on Korea Book Club. You'll recall earlier this month, Chang-ho and Barry talked about Bora Chung's Cursed Bunny, a collection of short stories which included her debut story titled The Head. She is, however, more than a writer. In addition to publishing 3 novels and 3 short story collections, she also works as a literary translator from Russian and Polish to Korean. She also teaches Russian language and literature and science fiction at Yonsei University. So it is our pleasure to welcome in the studio Bora Chung, who joins us to talk about her fascination with fantasy and science fiction. Welcome, Bora.
Hello. Hi.
It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So you won the 1998 Yonsei Literature Prize for your first story, The Head, which is also included in your recently translated book, Cursed Bunny, that, again, I just mentioned we introduced in our book segment with Barry Welsh a few weeks ago. And you wrote this while you were still a college student, I understand. So had it always been your dream to write?
No. There was a cash prize with the reward. So with the award, so I wanted the money. It was the equivalent of $1,000.
Okay,
which
is a lot of money for a college student.
Yes, still to this day, and I thought. It was a short story. They didn't accept novels. They wanted short stories. So I thought I could do that and win the money. And I did.
Indeed. And thus began, I guess, your journey as a writer and much, much more, which we'll, of course, will unpack in the coming, time that we have together. So your writing is described as fantasy meets science fiction. I don't know if you would agree with that characterization, but what was the appeal of the genre, and perhaps how would you yourself describe your writing?
Well, there's the term speculative fiction, and which includes science fiction, but as I understand it, it's more encompassing. It's a larger genre than just science fiction. It's science fiction and fantasy. And by fantasy, I think these days people think swords and sorcerers and dragons and those kind of stuff. And I wrote one story about dragons, but I usually don't do sorcerers. So I do them separately. Swords separate, sorcerers separate, dragons separate, not all of them together. So I guess I'm not a fantasy writer. But I would like to think of myself as a writer of speculative fiction or unrealistic fiction, not exactly science fiction, because I'm more drawn to horror.
Ah, interesting. So unrealistic fiction. And in fact, I started reading your short story, The Head, which actually begins with a description of a head-like formation popping up out of your toilet, and you start the narrator, I guess, begins a conversation with this entity. So I'm just curious, when you write your stories, where do your ideas come from?
I like to set my stories in places where I like, and I like bathrooms. Like I like clean bathrooms.
It's something we can all identify with, right?
And I like clean bathrooms, but when the toilet is clogged, you have a big problem. So
not where you want to be. No.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So that has the element of horror, I suppose.
Sure.
So that's where I start. I try to fiddle. I try to do something with familiar things.
You begin with familiar territory and then
go the opposite way, as opposite as possible.
Ah, that's so interesting. So where do you think your fascination with horror specifically comes from?
Well, I am an Asian person, and Asian urban myths or fairy tales have a lot of elements of the horror or the supernatural or the uncanny. And I especially love Japanese horror stories. Uh-huh. I love ghost stories. And they suggest that there is something more to this world than the eyes meet. And what we think of as human reason is so limited, and there's this vast world outside of our realm, our very limited, very small realm. And that makes the entire universe more interesting.
I see. And on that note, in past years, we've seen more and more works of South Korean science fiction writers, as well as, other supernatural or ghost stories, as you have mentioned, capturing the international spotlight. We're seeing more South Korean science fiction being introduced in foreign languages. So why do you think we're seeing this trend at this point in time?
Well, we have good writers. We have hidden gems who are still waiting to be translated. And the writers that I personally like, they have their own very special, unique kind of point of view. And I think the science fiction writer Pan Myung-hoon wrote it in his book, and also Kim Bo-young mentioned something similar. We have never been the center of the universe. So Korean science fiction is a little different from the American space opera or the Japanese science fiction. We just don't have the urge to go and conquer something. We usually start with smaller things, and we usually have this very specific point of view that makes you, I suppose, sympathize with the protagonist or the narrator. And also, my students told me that Korean science fiction tends to focus more on the social problems in Korea. So as a Korean reader, you can understand more. I don't know how that translates. I'm not a translator of Korean literature, so I don't know how that translates into other languages, but I suppose the Koreanness could seem more interesting.
And as we've seen in the success of Bong Joon-ho's flick that some people may have watched or come across, I think a lot of those social ills are universal in nature as well. But before we tap into your experience and journey as a translator, I do want to talk about Cursed Bunny. This is your first book to be translated into the English language. So, I'm presuming you wrote it in Korean initially. So what did you expect people to take away from your stories, and what has the response been like so far?
I never thought any of my stories would be translated into any language. So it was a great big surprise. And my translator, Mr. Anton Hur, he's very good at he's a fantastic translator, and he's also very good at the business aspects. So he's monitoring the reviews. and
he's your manager.
Yeah, he is. And he sends me, from time to time, he sends me good reviews that he likes. So from what I see, people like it, but my translator doesn't necessarily send me all the bad reviews. So I have no idea what the overall.
Nor do you look them up, I guess.
No.
Not that.
I'm too scared.
I see. Could you, for those of us who perhaps have not learned about the book yet or read the book yet, was there a theme or a message that you wanted to get across with the collection of short stories, and why is it called Cursed Bunny?
Well, the original Korean title was supposed to be The Bunny of Curses. But that sounds too weird in English, I suppose. It's the entire collection is about revenge. And I think a lot of Korean stories and a lot of Korean films are about revenge. Like we
Korean dramas, perhaps.
Yeah, we are this vicious people who always want to pay back. How come we became this really mean people? And I didn't intend the book to be about revenge. It was my publisher who selected these stories and put them in this order. So it was his vision and his kind of business plan, because there are so many stories about revenge. Maybe
incidentally, there was a theme.
So that was one thing, and the short story Curse Bunny is about a small company that made traditional Korean liquor for generations, and then the whole company and the owner is destroyed by a bigger company that runs a smear campaign. So it's about justice, and it's about the small people who can't really do anything about this evil tide that comes their way. So that's what happens. And other stories are similar, I suppose. I didn't want to be the writer of revenge stories, but that's how I ended up.
I can see what you mean by kind of social criticism, though, in the way that you just briefly described Cursed Bunny. And I guess in some ways, as writers, we are also translators of the society that we live in currently. So if we can delve into, I guess, the translation part of your life next, what kind of works have you translated, or what kind of works are you drawn to translate? And what in particular, I mean, how did you begin with the Russian and Polish languages? They're not the most common or, I guess, popular languages here in this country.
Well, as I told you, I was a miserable failure during my college years. And in spite of all of that, I liked Russian literature. They were different, and especially the early 20th century communist literature, because they were banned in Korea for such a long time.
Do you remember how you came across your first piece of Russian literature? Was it in college?
No, it was the canonical Dostoevsky and Tolstoy stuff.
Got it. Okay.
So I thought Russian literature was really, really boring.
And very, very long.
Yes, with really long names. But I went to college and I started taking modern Russian literature classes, and they were so different, and they were talking about building a new country, and that was really fascinating. They were talking about their own experiences as opposed to some pipe dream of utopia. And they actually went through this, in reality. And later they were talking about the Stalinist era and how their dreams crumbled and everything became a bloodbath and the purge and the horrors. So that historical drama was in and of itself moving in certain ways. And I started to see things differently because I am a child of the Cold War era. So I'm so old. So those things were forbidden from my experience. And then now I have access, and these are beautiful. So, and I couldn't understand any of it in the original language. So I tried to, in my effort to understand what was going on, I tried to translate pieces of the material that I was supposed to read. Not long, like chapters, but just pieces, paragraphs. And my professor noticed it, and I guess my translation wasn't as bad as I thought. So he suggested that I go into translation.
And thus began your journey into Slavic languages. You went on to Yale University to study Russian and East European area studies and got your master's there, and Slavic literatures from Indiana University, where you got your PhD. And fast forward all these years, you continue to really. Do you feel like you're a trailblazer of sorts in these Slavic languages here in South Korea? Also because you teach the languages at Yonsei University, your alma mater.
Not exactly a trailblazer. There are so many more teachers who are more experienced and better than I am. But when I translate, I try to translate works that have not been yet translated into Korean. So I try to do that. I've never dared to think of myself as a trailblazer.
Perhaps it was a big question. I mean, I guess none of us would really say, yes, I'm a trailblazer. But
I guess I'm fumbling. I'm a
fumbling
fumbler.
Trailblazer. As I mentioned, you do teach Russian language and literature and science fiction at Yonsei University, in addition to being a writer and translator. How do you divide your time among all of these hats that you wear? And is there one that you particularly have, a soft spot for?
I don't divide my time. People like tell me when the deadline is, and then I start working on it. I love teaching my science fiction class. I love my students. My students are weird. They're very special. I guess the weird bunch finds me every single semester. And the students of my Russian 101 class, they suffer through the semester. I feel so guilty because it's such a torture.
Why? Why do you say that?
They have to start with the alphabet. They have to memorize the alphabet. And then they have to learn how to write it in print and in cursive. Because in Russia, if you don't know how to write in cursive, they think you're not educated. You've never been to school. That's why you can't write cursive.
That's interesting.
So you have to learn how to write cursive. And then they have to start reading these horribly long words. And, yeah.
So it's not that you're a bad teacher. It's just that the language itself is
really
difficult.
hard.
It's challenging.
Yeah, it is really hard, and we suffer through it together.
There must be a lot of camaraderie by the end of the school year.
And they have really good questions. That's the common thing about my students. They have really good questions.
Okay.
They help me learn.
As the final question, I guess, for the general public that are not familiar with Russian literature or language or Slavic languages, but are curious, having listened to this interview, what would you say is a good way to approach the literature? Perhaps something that we may not know about Russian and Slavic literature?
Just run away. I would say start with contemporary women writers if you're interested in really intense literature, or if you're interested in the supernatural or magical, start with The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. He is the master, and it's one of its kind. And there are so many good writers, so I can't really list them all.
Okay. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, Bora. Thank you so much for your time. I am afraid we have to cap it here, but hopefully we can have you back for a continuation of our conversation.
Thank you.